I'm really excited to share about the first couple of points here. So sustained community engagement really is the backbone for inclusive infrastructure planning. And early community visioning is really key to this as well. So I'm going to dive into this, and you'll see throughout the next 2 days where we are using this conceptual map. And you can refer to your resource guide as well if you need a little help with orientation as we go through today. So to think about when it comes to successful infrastructure projects, what is the best thing about community engagement? And what is the worst thing or the most challenging, that's kind of tongue-in-cheek there, the most challenging thing about community engagement, or what some of the harms that can come with community engagement as well. Great. So I'm going to just dive into some of the things that we've learned along the way. First off, we've been using this term infrastructure, and that is a really broad word. We've known that infrastructure has advanced many community interests because it's all around us. It's the essential equipment, the structures, and the systems that we use to run our society, right? So that includes roads, mass transit, airports that help communities move around. It's power and energy generation that keeps life sustaining equipment on, that for some of us keep our houses warm in the winter. And infrastructure is also what allows us to have clean and sufficient drinking water. So our pipes, our utilities, our waste management systems are all a really important part of the infrastructure that keep us healthy and safe. As a lot of you know, and definitely what's near and dear to us at Willamette Partnership is that infrastructure is not just the built infrastructure, it's also our surrounding natural landscape. So forests are really important for purifying water and making sure we have sufficient water in our water table. Healthy floodplains, for example, are a way to increase flood protection. They also help filter water and recharge our aquifers. And so when we look at these natural systems in partnership with our built infrastructure, that's the key to having a healthy and thriving community. That all sounds great. However, as a lot of you are acutely aware, our infrastructure is aging and the costs of repairs are expected to be incredibly high. So I pulled some stats from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and they have some staggering estimates of what funding is needed to repair and maintain these systems over the next 20 years. So in Oregon, an estimated $6.3 billion will be needed for drinking water. $3.9 billion will be needed for wastewater. And there are 158 high hazard dams that are rated as unacceptable and need to be updated, as well as 30% of our levies. So a lot of investment is needed. And if you're not from Oregon or you want to look at more details, you can find stats from ASCE at infrastructurereportcard.org, and we'll drop that in the chat for you all. We can no longer afford to design infrastructure that addresses a single issue. And I believe, and us here, we all believe that understanding community priorities through really good community engagement will help us be strategic in these infrastructure investments. And it'll allow us to offer more benefits that go above and beyond what the direct solution to a particular infrastructure project is. That being said, not all of our communities have historically or currently benefited equally from infrastructure projects. And the harm of some infrastructure, this can include community displacement, proximity to toxic exposure, decades of divestment. Often these harms disproportionately fall on working class communities, rural communities, and communities of color. Oftentimes, these communities are also disproportionately impacted by environmental degradation despite contributing the least to it. So my overall point here is that our infrastructure decisions are inextricably linked to our community health outcomes. Something I've been thinking about is, as we plan for future investments in infrastructure, how can we incorporate community co-benefits? How can we repair the unjust infrastructure investments of the past and how can we create healthy landscapes and communities of the future? So that's a big question, and I'd like you all to think about that. And if you have thoughts, drop it in the chat. But how can we incorporate community co-benefits, repair the unjust infrastructure investments of the past, and create healthy landscapes of the future? Personally, I think that community engagement is integral to infrastructure planning, and listening to Shauna and others in the chat, there seems to be a cultural shift too that agree. Community input helps incorporate that local knowledge of community assets, needs, and priorities. And when we have good community engagement, we can find that the most meaningful solutions are also the ones that benefit those impacted the most. So I would like to share with you some of the strategies that we've learned along the way to engage communities authentically. And just a disclaimer here that what I'm presenting is only a guide. It's only from our experience. It's not an exhaustive list. It's not a checklist. There are a few strategies that perhaps you can take with you to improve your community visioning and engagement. And really, this is to help set you up for success for InfrastructureNext approach. So as I chat, please feel free to add to this list and add your perspectives and wisdom to this as well. Okay, so the first strategy that we've identified is it's actually taking a couple steps back and understanding the local context of the place that you're working and the historical context as well. So we really want to have a firm understanding of how infrastructure has benefited or harmed members of the community that you're working in. And so this means recognizing that rural communities, working class communities, and communities of color disproportionately experience negative impacts of historical underinvestment, ecological degradation, and infrastructure investments. So some of the things that you can ask is, mapping out who's the most impacted by environmental hazards, by air pollution, water and electricity shutoffs, toxic fish consumption, who lives in like a food desert, who doesn't have access to green space. And we know that rural communities and low-income communities experience inequities when it comes to infrastructure benefits and harm. Yet, it's really important to note too that across the United States, race continues to be the most significant predictor of environmental harm in poor infrastructure. So, for example, people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are two times as likely to live without potable water or modern sanitation. So that's just one example of those who are most impacted by underinvestment in infrastructure. So after identifying, who these communities are, can you also begin to map out the community groups in your region that are supporting these communities? Community groups who've been building off of these folks' strengths and also have been working to address some of these environmental injustices. And what are ways to learn about their priorities and begin to brainstorm if and how your infrastructure project could potentially intersect with some of those efforts. So our second strategy is, again, understanding the role and importance and the power that your infrastructure project can have in building a resilient community. I think infrastructure, I come from a public health background, so I know how important infrastructure is to public health, to community resilience, and to well-being. And it really is, both built and natural infrastructure, a public health intervention because it has the opportunity to address environmental injustices, meet infrastructure needs, and promote better social, economic, and health outcomes for communities. So I just want to share one example of an infrastructure project that incorporated integrated health and community benefits. So this is an image here of the Crooked River Wetlands Complex in Prineville, Oregon. And what they did was, in addition to expanding their wastewater capacity, and they stabilized wastewater rates. So it was a little bit cheaper for ratepayers. But they also provided a bunch of other community co-benefits by choosing wetlands instead of a built infrastructure solution like a cooling tower. or pools, excuse me. So some of the co-benefits included working with the local school districts, and they brought school kids out to the site to explore, learn about wastewater treatment, learn about floodplains, and really start to build that foundation for workforce development. They also created public access trails, and we know that having access to outdoor spaces is really good for our physical health, because when we're outdoors, we're more likely to not be sedentary, and just have a little bit more movement and get fresh air. Access to outdoors is good for our mental health too, right? It can reduce stress. And we also know that projects like this can reduce exposure to toxic pollutants, mitigate impacts of natural disasters like flooding and fires. And so this is an example of an infrastructure solution to a wastewater treatment problem that had a lot of integrated co-benefits. We at WP, Willamette Partnership, really support natural infrastructure solutions, and we actually have a report linked in your resource guide of more examples of natural infrastructure and their co-benefits if you're interested, as well as extra information on this Prineville complex as well, and we'll drop that in the chat. Okay, so here's a third step that is really interesting. So investing in infrastructure is really important, but equally as important is investing in community capacity and engagement. So this is making sure we're investing not only in the infrastructure project itself, but into community groups that are trusted in the community and already doing work. That is essential if we're going to have inclusive infrastructure planning. There is an amazing quote from the Oregon Water Futures Report, which is a project that uplifts water and water infrastructure priorities from various Black, Indigenous, migrant, and communities of color across the state of Oregon. And I know there's folks in the crowd here who were part of that and played a really big role, especially in community engagement. I won't call you out, but if you want to share, please feel free to do so. But this quote says, and it really resonated with me. They found that, quote, investments in community capacity and engagement alongside infrastructure improvements are equally critical to building a more just and sustainable water future for all Oregonians. So I'll read that again. Investments in community capacity and engagement alongside infrastructure improvements are both critical to building a more just and sustainable water future for all Oregonians. Historically, infrastructure investments have not created equal benefits for all communities. Investing in community capacity and engagement that is led by and co-designed with tribes, with community-based organizations, with Black, Indigenous, and other leaders of color, and low-income and rural communities will open paths for more equitable laws and policies that serve communities as a whole. So I love this quote because it through community conversations found that it's just as important that we invest in community capacity alongside infrastructure investments. So as you're doing your planning process, are there ways that you can support community leaders and community-based organizations that are already doing the work in the community? Can you look at what they've published publicly to see what their priorities are? Can you work with your funding partners and let them know how important it is to fund and support capacity of these community groups in your planning process and why it's relevant? For those of you who do water infrastructure work in Oregon, the Oregon Water Futures Report is a great place to start. So, you might begin mapping who is impacted. You might map who is already at the table for your infrastructure plan, who are the typical stakeholders, who are the typical ones making decision-making roles. And as you start to map that out and think about both the modern and the historical context of infrastructure, you might find that you want to invite new stakeholders to the table. And so this really requires strengthening existing relationships, building new ones, and also really improving our external communications. So if we want to move beyond, like I said earlier, consultation to really co-creating and co-designing with those most impacted, we're going to have to start building and strengthening relationships. So There's no best way to do this, but there are some better practices to keep in mind. So the reason I like to use better practices instead of best practices is that best practice suggests that we have arrived at some ideal community engagement principle, but in reality, there's no single checklist. There's no perfect practice that fits every community. Every community is unique, made up of different community members. And so instead, I like the idea of better practices because it suggests that we continue to adapt, learn, and apply our experiences to the work that we're doing. So here are a couple better practices that we've learned along the way. And I know you all have that experience too. So please share if you have some others that you'd like to add. So first, when we're working with communities that are from a different culture than ours or our organization, it's really important that we understand and are clear that there's always learning to do. And we can never assume that our organization or whoever it is that's working on the project can possibly know what's best for a community, and especially in isolation from meaningful relationships with that community. So 2, avoid making decisions in the absence of those affected by those decisions. Another way of saying this more proactively is always include the most impacted and affected in both the brainstorming and the decision-making process. A couple better practices that we've learned from our partners at Oregon Water Futures that we try to use as a guide is to co-create outreach and engagement approaches that center community voices, trying to be flexible, adaptable, and creating as much access as possible, whether that is through language, through thinking about childcare needs or the timing of your meetings, or stipends. How can we create more access? We really want to tap into people's existing values and language, and of course, ensure that there's adequate funding. So in conclusion, innovative solutions can be challenging, but good community engagement and visioning can help set communities up for success. So, as we work with communities, with our own communities or with other communities, we're always aiming to meet partners where they're at. The InfrastructureNext approach starts with understanding a community's context, recognizing and honoring the constraints, fears, and challenges that they face, and working as partners with them through the process from vision to design to financing.